Sleepers Wake by Paul Samuel Jacobs, Apple paperback. To my brothers, Jerry, Eric and Howard. They travel with me. 1. Awakening. Teddy found himself watching the time, measuring it by the hour, by the minute, by the second all night long. Well before first light, he had turned on his tiny bed lamp and was staring at the clock face as the digits flowed like liquid, trickle by trickle through the night in a gathering torrent of time. He pulled out his writing pad and began a note to his friends back home, Alan and Tony. He had not seen them for years, but he still thought of them as the small boys he had left behind in California when he and his family had sold off all their belongings and moved to the Space Center in Florida to wait for the launch. Dear Alan and Tony, he wrote in a cursive of big looping letters that had not changed since he was in the 4th grade. He had learned a lot of things since he left Earth, but penmanship was not one of them. Today is the day I told you about, when the sleepers wake. I know that I should try to sleep myself to pair the time, but I can't. I haven't been sleeping for days just thinking about what's going to happen. It will be better than a birthday, better than Halloween and Christmas, better than all the holidays I can think of. It will even be better than that day all the rockets were launched, one after another like Roman candles into the sky. I guess you must have seen that on TV, and so you know that was some day. Today will be even better than that. After 50 years, I'm not going to have to wait anymore. Teddy said it aloud, although there was no one around who could possibly hear him. 50 years. His voice was unexpectedly high-pitched and a bit gruff, because the words were the first he had spoken for hours. It sounded like hinges that needed oiling. After 50 years, all the hinges on the spacecraft required repeated oiling, so he knew the sound of rusting hinges very well. He went back to his writing. My life is going to be so different after today. Teddy could not think of anything more to say to his friends. So he signed the note in even bigger letters than he usually made so that he filled up the rest of the page. Yours sincerely, Daddy. He tore out the note, folded it and placed it carefully in a crumbling cardboard box that he kept under his bunk. He had filled 7 such boxes with letters to Alan and Tony, because there was no way of mailing them. Someday, he hoped he would deliver all the letters. He could imagine their expressions when he handed them box after box. It would be like the excitement of picking up all the mail at the post office after a long vacation. But he wondered if he would ever see them again out here, 100 years away from Earth by rocket. And if they met again, what would they be like? Would they be the boys he had played catch with or skipped rocks with at the pond in the city park? Or would they be old men like him, wrinkled and grey, changed so much that he would have trouble recognizing them? And if they hadn't left in the next wave of rockets, they might be gone forever, as dead as most of the things Daddy had left behind. But when he wrote to them, they lived on somehow just the way he remembered them. Tony, hitting a ball into the ivy beyond the left field fence of the Little League field, and Alan, lofting a paper airplane of his own design from the outstretched branch of their favorite live oak tree. And he was there with them, watching the ball fly over his head or throwing a plane of his own from the highest branches. Teddy looked at the digital clock and was surprised at how little it had changed. A few minutes had slipped by but the hour seemed glued into place. It's a very long time to be waiting, he said aloud, as if he expected a reply. After a little pause, he answered himself. Not so long, now that it's about over. That was the way Daddy was, always jabbering away, asking questions and answering them, caroling with himself one minute and agreeing with himself the next. A hermit behaved the same way. Like a hermit, Teddy had only himself to talk to, only himself for company. Mickey, as he called them, Astringcraft Computer finally turned on the overhead lamps in the sleeping quarters ever so faintly. The dim morning lights, which grew ever brighter, were vaguely reddish at first, like the dawn, signaling the end of another night. It was Daddy's favorite time of day. He remembered his father waking him up by placing a warm hand on his shoulder. Don't let the sun leave you behind, little guy, his father always said in his deep, steady voice. The glowing tubes of morning light gradually revealed the mess that was his room. An archaeologist could have written a history of Daddy's life just by cataloging the clumps of clothes, the layers of equipment, the games and toys and models left in place just where Daddy had finished with them. There were cartons and computer printouts and books filling up all the unused bunks. Pictures and maps and handwritten notes and drawings were pinned one on top of the other, filling every inch of wall. Miniature airplanes dangled from the ceiling, a squadron flying in tight formation. All by himself, he had managed to fill to overflowing every nook and every cranny of a room that was supposed to sleep 12. Only his own bunk was free of debris. A little later today, he'd finally get around to tidying it all up. It was something he had been promising himself he would do for quite a few days now. Most of it he would cart down to the evacuation chamber and jettison to space, where even the junk of lifetime would disappear in the empty vastness like so much dust. But cleaning up could wait a little longer. He was much too excited for it now. He got out of bed, and after kicking the floor clear to make a place for himself, he stretched as tall as he could, slowly raising his arms in the direction of the model fighter planes and bombers. As he reached up, his joints popped and his bones crackled. Then, bending his knees just a little, he dipped down low to touch his distant toes, and his whole body seemed to creak as he did so. "That's one," he said in a voice that was a bit less rusty now. It was a thin, reedy voice, too high-pitched to suit his body. He repeated the movements, counting aloud until he finally announced to the air, or, perhaps, to a photograph of his family that hung by itself on the wall above his bed, "That's 13, I'm done." He was a little breathless. "I used to be able to do 100 with no sweat," he explained. "Now I do just a couple and I'm winded." He ran his hands through his still, grey hair, which he had long ago given up either cutting or combing. The wildness of the hair made him look a little mad, but it wasn't worth the bother to keep it neat, any more than it was to keep his room tidy. He was dressed as usual in his uniform, grey coveralls that zipped up the front, with the red arrow insignia of the space agency over the heart. He wore his uniform day and night, remembering to change it every few days or so, but not minding much if there was a blotch of grease on a sleeve or a tear right through to a kneecap or elbow. He wore a faded red bandana around his neck. It was quite frayed around the edges and worn through in several places. He'd begun wearing it as a boy because she thought it made him look like a cowboy, but now he wore it out of habit, hardly giving a thought to the reason. Besides, it made a handy substitute for an napkin when he was eating his dinner. As he scuffed his way through the portal of the bedroom and into the corridor, he was still panting a little from the exercise. But, just as he did every day, he mounted his bicycle. In fact, it wasn't really a bicycle. It had 3 wheels and not 2, a contraption he'd built for himself 30 years ago. It was close to the ground, and he rode in it feet first, while leaning back into a chair and pedaling forward. With very little effort, Teddy careened through the hallways of the spaceship, racing along the main corridors until he got back where he'd begun. The ship was huge, as if a 30-story apartment building had been fitted with rockets and launched into space. There were 100 rooms and stations and a few miles of corridors that crossed one another like intersecting boulevards. But Daddy had the roads to himself as he went around and around, weaving from side to side as he pedaled, speeding up and then braking as he came dangerously close to sideswiping a wall. When he was much younger, he'd crashed the vehicle, his body spilling out and tumbling until he was stopped by a sheet of metal. He had heard the sharp snap when the upper part of his left arm had broken. Since there was no one else to help him, he'd splinted it himself. Although it healed in time, the arm was never quite the same as the other, because it had grown together a bit shorter and a little twisted. And forever after, the aching arm was a reminder to be careful. But it did not keep him off his bike. Today, after a short spin, he dismounted and headed straight for his favorite spot to finish his exercise. It was a wonderful room, the most splendid on the craft. The floor was a window, a broad transparent sheet, clear as glass but sturdy as steel. He called the room his solarium, the sun room, although it was decades since the sun's rays had shone into it. Teddy ran and skipped and hopped in place for several minutes, looking down as he exercised at the dark vastness of space that spun by below. Of course, it was the spacecraft that was spinning and not the starry universe outside. It was the spin that created the illusion of the stars whirling by in a blur of moving lights. That was the way he saw them every morning and the way he dreamed about them at night, although he could still remember from his childhood on Earth looking up at stars that did not seem to move at all. He dropped to his stomach to begin his daily quota of push-ups, but he paused to watch the stars, the spiraling galaxies and the stellar clouds streaking by. Stretched out, his eyes on the stars, he felt as if he were flying through the depths of space. In most of the windowless rooms and corridors of the craft, he could not sense that he was moving at almost light speed through the universe. But here he knew it because he could feel it. He pushed his long body from the floor with his wiry arms. "That's one," he said. He stopped at 10 instead of his usual 30. He'd planned to stick to the routine he had been following for 50 years, but he couldn't. Oh, he did try a few chin-ups and some sit-ups, too, but his heart wasn't in them and hadn't been for weeks now. He pedaled himself slowly to his bedroom in the crew's quarters and headed to the bathroom. There Daddy looked at his face in the mirror, noticing a faint stubble of grey hairs on his cheeks that he'd been ignoring for days. As he ran the tingling bowl-shaped razor over his face until his skin was smooth and shining, he tried to remember what he had looked like 50 years ago. His hair had been a light brown with a cowlick that refused to lie down. His rounded cheeks and compact nose were sprinkled with freckles from the sun. He had become faded and worn, like his bandana. He was torn and frayed like the uniform he wore. "Look at the old guy," he commanded his younger self. "Nothing much to look at," he answered back. "Pretty much the way you always looked." He shed his clothes and stepped into the shower, a narrow tube that he closed about him. Its hundreds of jets sprayed him from every angle, first with soap and then with clear, hot water, and finally with warm air to dry him. It still reminded him of a car wash. Sometimes he went for weeks without a shower. After all, why did it matter? There was no one to see him, no one to smell him, no one to care whether he was pig-pen dirty or car wash clean. Mickey the computer didn't care. But today, of all days, it did matter. Daddy remembered for once to pick up his old coveralls and drop them into the laundry, along with a mound of discarded clothes he had neglected for a couple of months. Then he pulled a bright new uniform from the clean clothes bin, one without any holes in it, one that was as stiff and neatly creased as it had been when it was new. Daddy didn't much like the feel of it against his skin, but he wore it anyway because of the special occasion. After tying his old bandana around his neck, he ambled over to the dining hall, his limbs feeling a little looser now that he had exercised and taken a warm shower. He found himself singing as he walked. His own voice calmed and comforted him. Loudly he sang, "My country 'tis of the sweet land of liberty, of the I sing." His twangy voice seemed to fill the entire ship when he got to the part, "From every mountainside, let freedom ring." Where was his country? He wondered. The one he had left behind he would likely never live to see again, as much as he wanted to. And he had no idea what the land ahead of him might be like. It was light years distant from Earth, a colony that travelers from the first wave of rockets should have reached and settled 30 years before. He felt like one of the European settlers who followed Columbus and Magellan and Vasco da Gama to make a home of their own in a faraway land. The dining hall, one of several on the ship, could seat 12 at a time, but as he had for the past 5 decades, Daddy ate breakfast alone. He typed the necessary code into the computer terminal to tell Mickey he was ready to eat. It was Wednesday, so he had pancakes for breakfast as he had for the past 2,600-odd Wednesdays. Mickey was programmed that way. French toast on Monday, Tuesday eggs and bacon, Wednesday pancakes with a choice of synthetic maple or blueberry syrup. Daddy was tired of pancakes on Wednesdays, even with a choice of syrup, and just as tired of eggs and bacon on Tuesdays. He was tired of the unending succession of lonely, predictable breakfasts. But when he tried to change the routine, Mickey had flatly refused to allow it, just as he refused to allow changing wake-up times or adding extra portions of dessert. "That's outside your jurisdiction, Daddy," Mickey would say, in what was supposed to be a calming voice, showing neither anger nor excitement. Daddy knew that Mickey was just a collection of circuit boards and wires, with no feelings to express, with a voice designed to be pleasant and polite. But Daddy imagined that Mickey sounded disapproving, the way his father or mother would if he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't. The voice irritated him, and once he'd even tried to turn it off completely by programming the computer, but Mickey had ejected, saying simply, "That's outside your jurisdiction, Daddy." That had been years ago. But in all the time, he had not stopped trying to convince an unbending Mickey to alter the way the ship was run. Nevertheless, because it was Wednesday, the oven popped open with the usual stack of pancakes, and Daddy pushed aside the plates that had collected from several previous meals and ate what he could. He thought about clearing away the dishes, and maybe if there had been other people around to notice what a mess the dining hall was in, he would have. Instead, he decided to clean up a little later, after he played a game of chess with Mickey, so that the time would pass a little more quickly. Sitting at a computer terminal in his bedroom, Teddy soon grew impatient with the GAN and chose to take advantage of a weakness in Mickey's programming that he had first discovered 15 years before. Although he knew he would beat Mickey, Teddy still felt disappointed that he had dumb computer brain. Teddy said to an unhearing Mickey, as soon as he was able to type checkmate into the terminal, "You're such a lousy chess player, I don't know why I bother to play you anymore." Mickey wasn't insulted. "That is checkmate," the computer affirmed, as he always did when he lost a chess game. "Congratulations, Teddy. You played a fine game. Would you like to play another?" Mickey spoke so cheerfully that it took away what little pleasure there might have been in beating him. Oh, Teddy typed an emphatic no, and walked over to the music room. Long ago, Teddy had read all of the books in the crafts library more than once, even the two encyclopedias. He had listened to all the ship's music many times over, watched all of the movies, completed and repeated all of the tutorials, and endlessly played all of the games in Mickey's catalog of programs. Teddy was bored with all of it. But he did not curse the designers of the spacecraft, because they had thought to do one thing that saved him from years of boredom and probably madness, too. They had put a pipe organ on board, and they had filled the music room shelves with the finest of music. In a lifetime, Teddy could not have mastered it all, even though he played for hours every day. He had begun playing the music of Bach when he was a boy, learning the piano back on Earth, hating the lessons and the long hours of practice. His mother had told him he had to do it. At first, it was a memory of his mother's voice that started him playing again. "Trust me, Daddy," she had said, "if you work hard at your lessons now, you'll be glad you did when you're older." Now, a man of almost 60, he sat down at the bench in front of the keyboard and lost himself in the music that had been written centuries before. He tossed his head back and forth and swayed to the rhythms of melody and counterpoint, humming along with the main parts while his feet danced over the pedal keys. Daddy, after all the years of practice, had become very, very good, even though there was no one to appreciate his playing. Time moved quickly for a change as the music devoured the remainder of the morning. The last piece he played was one of his favorites, a hymn by Bach called "Sleepers, Wake." He'd first learned the melody when he was a boy, and he'd never tired of it. It was melancholy music, recalling his family's living room at home with a spinet off in the corner and a drawing in bright pastels. His mother had sat beside him, playing the left hand while he played the right. She'd smelled of lavender perfume, and a faint ghost of the scent seemed to fill the room every time he played the ship's pipe organ. He stopped suddenly and looked at his watch. "Oh, gee," he said. "I don't want to be late." He forgot all about cleaning up his room or clearing the dishes. In a panic, he dashed into a corridor that led to a room deep within the body of the craft. Above the entranceway, he saw a metallic plaque, engraved with the words "Hibernetic Swan." He touched the sign and rubbed it for good luck, leaving a smudge of fingerprints. Then he typed his code into the locking mechanism. The portal moved aside with a quick-like chirrup. The chamber was lit like a photographic darkroom, aglow in a dim, red light. Arranged in berths about him, stacked 6 high on every wall, were coffin-lid boxes, made of gleaming steel, each with a handle on its side. At the head of each box was a transparent bubble, through which Teddy could make out the profile of a face. On one wall, however, the box on the second shelf from the top was different. There was no face inside its globe of clear plastic, only a black emptiness. "This one hatched a long time ago," Teddy said, tapping the empty globe. Years before, Teddy often came to this room just to look at the faces, to study them and remember. But as he grew older, the memories proved too painful, and he'd visited less and less often. I haven't been in this room for 7 years," he said a bit guiltily. "There wasn't anything I could have done. I tried everything I could think of, but there wasn't anything." The faces within the clear bubbles did not hear him, or at least did not show it if they did. Instead, they slept on, as they had for the past 50 years, their red eyelids closed, their red faces still as death. But suddenly a panel of instruments that hung from the ceiling came alive with flashing lights. 12 noon relative time. Preparing to inject Chambers Wonder through ID, a speaker announced in a voice that was distinctly Mickey's. Teddy's heart began to pound and quiver within his chest, like a sizable frog trying to hop up into his throat. Behind him, suddenly and without warning, came a prolonged hiss from one bank of boxes. "What's that?" he asked. He could see that 4 of the transparent bubbles were filling with a dense vapor that obscured the faces. The singing sound of the gas jet stopped, and the room was so silent for a moment or two that Eddie could hear the rapid beating of his own heart. 12:09, relative time. "Evacuating Companies 1 to through ID," Mickey announced. Eddie could hear the churning of a motor and then the whoosh of vacuum pulling the foggy gas away from the faces. He studied them closely now that he could see them plainly again. Their ruddy faces belonged to a man and a woman far younger than Eddie and to a boy and a girl. The noses of the children were alike short and turned up a little at the end, the plump cheeks, too, and so was the white placement of the eyes. The woman and the 2 children were dusted with freckles, but the man was not. Eddie knew he would only have to wait a few minutes now. He began to dance with impatience, hopping about like a jaybird in a neighborhood full of cats. 12:13, relative time. "Decompression and full oxygenation," Mickey declared. "Oh, for Giles Day!" Eddie shouted. "Kalu. Calais." 12:14, relative time. Sensors show blood gases within normal limits. Body temperature at 37 degrees Celsius. "Chambers unlocked," said Mickey, in his usual, matter-of-fact way. Eddie rushed up to the wall, ducking down to glance first at the man's face, then the woman's, then the boy's and then the girl's. He bobbed up and down, looking for even the smallest sign of life, a twitch, a blink, an open eye. And then he saw that the woman yawned, swallowed and smacked her lips together. And the side of her box fell open as she turned the handle from within and then stretched out her limbs. The freckles had been preserved on her face, visible through a rosy tan. Her light brown hair was still bleached golden from the sun. "I'm so very dry," she said hoarsely to no one in particular, her eyes not yet open. "I want a drink of water." To Eddie, there was no more beautiful sound on earth than that raspy whisper of a voice. It was even more lovely than bark on the pipe organ, more exhilarating than the most lilting soprano. He moved so close to her that he could feel her warm breath upon his face. He could smell that chemicals, sharp and stinging. Her eyes blinked open. "Father!" she exclaimed. "Oh, Papa," she said, throwing her arms around Eddie's head. And then her voice seemed troubled as she pushed him away. "But you're not supposed to be here, Father. We left you behind. Is something the matter?" "I'm not your father," Eddie said very softly. She blinked a few more times as if to clear her vision. "No, I can see you're not," the woman said, her forehead furrowed as she tried to remember. "But you look so much like him." "I guess I do," Eddie said. She did not seem to recognize him at all. "He and I are related, too." She rose from her berth and stood shakily under the red lamps, staring at him with great intensity. The woman looked as if she were trying to think of a word or name that was on the tip of her tongue. "Who are you?" the woman demanded at last. "I have to know who you are." "I'm Daddy," he whispered. "David Mark Ramsey." "Daddy?" she said in disbelief, reaching out to touch the faded, ragged red bandana. "You aren't my little Daddy." But then she examined him again, and her eyes opened very, very wide. "Daddy," she said, crushing him to her. "What's happened to you, my little baby boy?"